Hello and most welcome to 1253 of the series. And nota bene, look here, the windows here cannot be opened. I managed to get it up anyway. And I say this little cubicle is devoid of fresh air. A sustenance for the human mind, mostly the mind, but the body. And I think this clearly shows, despite the nice window, which is very good, very important for us to have access to the fractality of nature. We know we get sick if we don't get it. But fresh air, this is an utterly disembodied environment. And this is going to be the summation, my take on Roberto Unger and Lee Smolin so far. The causes of what they were proposing run havoc in science and the sciences, the knowledges of all areas, and the revealment that can lead to the opening of the Western mind, in contrast to Mr. Bloom's closing of the Western mind. Bloom pointed out that the Western, or the American mind, is closing. I agree, but he doesn't have any advice to give or any hint of what we should do instead. This is what we should do. Understand how it closed itself, and we don't even have to do anything for thinking to blossom once more. Once we understand that we put in an unnecessary obstacle, a constriction into our thinking, the thinking itself will be widened, deepened, and embodied. Because there is no intellectual life whatsoever with this. No one can say, well, we're just ignoring the body, the mind is continuing. That's absolute nonsense. I think enough in this series has been shown that thinking is the body. And only mind, as Richard E. Lean puts it, only mind is just a repetitious, automated, non-deepened, non-intellectual process. This is why we, for such a long time, almost 50, 60 years now, had the idea that the human mind is a computer. Why? Because it was a computer. The closing of the American/Western mind is the computerization of our intellects. Oddly enough, the development of computers had nothing to do with the development of human mind to become computers, or very close to them. Well, lesser working computers. Repetitive, non-thinking, non-deepening, yes. Effective, no. Maybe in some few cases. The Newtonian paradigm has gotten its death knell. The bell been chiming, and with Roberto Unger, the chimes will turn into a mourning process of the paradigm that went, that never, I would say, never was a paradigm even. It was a collection of confusions. It is not consistent to be a model. Well, I continue. I'm going to take two strains here from different areas. I would start with reading the Parenthesis by Robert Grant Williams. And I will add to that mindfulness in every day with an introduction from John Kabat-Zinn. I will just start with Robert G. Williams. I'll be happy to get back to it, but I see commonalities here with a cosmological fallacy. So reading the text will give more once the blossoming is coming up. No actual changes to the text, what I know is necessary. No, in some cases, but hopefully not here. Reading the Parenthesis by Robert Grant Williams. A little quote: "The phenomenon had not been worth a parenthesis." By Tristram Shandy. The parenthesis as marginalized figure. Even though structuralist linguistics and deconstruction have resuscitated rhetoric as a legitimate hermeneutical code, the four master troops established by Vico in the 18th century and popularized by Burke in our own century seem to dominate contemporary discussions on figurative language. Limiting rhetoric scope still further, Jacobson, Levi-Strauss and Lacan have built a closed binary system around metaphor and metonymy to such a degree that, with the exception of synecdoche and irony, hundreds of figures receive little or no critical attention in interpreting texts. By no means an infrequent rhetorical structure, the parenthesis exemplifies the marginalization of certain figures, primarily schemes. Since not only has little been said about the parenthesis, but what has been said in literary handbooks sounds strikingly denigrating and dismissive. From the Renaissance to the present, value judgments have obfuscated the ways in which the parenthesis generates meaning, and often have we wheedled themselves into definitions of this figure. Note the above epigraph. Had John de la Casse, in composing Galateo, been as prolific and as discursive as any dull-witted clerk, he, according to Tristram Shandy, would have produced a treatise unworthy of mentioning in a digression. Tediously spanning the age of Methuselah in sheer length, this imaginary version of Galateo would, no doubt, squander readers' precious time, and in effect would be less edifying than its most trivial part. The interruption, the insertion, the aside. For my purpose, the above epigraph no longer just a line in the middle of an 18th century novel may stand alone among other rules. It functions not only as the first parenthetical mark of this essay, but more significantly as a telling moment in the history of commentary on the bracketed aside. If we assume the epigraph illustrates the trope of sentences known as hyperbole, then modifying its syntax seems to betray Tristram Shandy's opinion of the parenthesis. The parenthesis is not worth the least of phenomena. Needless to write, the epigraph depends on our understanding of worth for much of its import. Let us suppose that worth is a relational concept and, in the above context, can be determined by arranging the free texts, the Galateo, the imaginary Galateo, and the parenthesis in an economic order of value. In lacking worth, the phenomenon, the imaginary Galateo, occupies a position 2 removes from true worthiness. The hierarchical structure implied in the epigraph and in the surrounding passage confers upon the real Galateo the highest degree of worth, it being primary discourse, outside of the parenthetical comments in a text. Next in the epigraph's implicit hierarchy comes interruptive discourse, the parenthesis. And finally, occupying the position of least value comes the discourse of the imaginary Galateo. However, if this epigraph is indeed exaggeration, then the parenthesis really occupies that inferior position to which Tristram Shandy, in a hyperbolic gesture, consigns the phenomenon. So within the order of worth here outlined, I will rewrite the epigraph. The parenthesis is not worth pence. The parenthesis is not worth dross. Not worth slag, refuse, debris, waste. If the rewritten epigraph is couched in the colloquial vernacular, it may correspond to a popular idiomatic expression. Oi, the parenthesis is not worth a shit. Whether or not it is a hyperbolic figure, Tristram Shandy's denunciation of the imaginary version of Galateo represents an appropriate epitaph for the parenthesis as well as for all dead, unread literature. The epitaph meaning here an inscription putting to rest that which should remain unseen, while judging such texts as dead. In fact, the parenthesis and the phenomenon appear inseparably bound, each embodying the other's epitaph. Just as inferior literary discourse should be bracketed off from proper literary history, should only be mentioned in a passing remark, the parenthesis belongs with rambling, long-winded, incoherent works which, unlike the real Galateo, fail to achieve a discursive integrity. But the epigraph does render a contrary reading. A name day ceremony, a christening, interferes with the liturgy of what had seemed a funeral service. The epigraph's denunciation of the parenthesis is itself expressed through a parenthetical construction. The dashes framing this statement, exert the pressure of a wider grammatical context that the reader must not omit from his or her exegesis. While discussing his father's attempt to write a Tristapeda, a system of education for himself, Shandy launches into a short exposition concerning Archbishop John de la Casse. In the midst of the exposition, he then imagines what kind of treatise would have been conceived had the Archbishop not been a genius. Arguably, neither interlude is significant to an overall narrative line, but these interruptions represent the text as well, because Tristram Shandy possesses little narrative line to bear any significance on. This text unfolds by enfolding digression within digression ad infinitum, and as a result, its readers become more and more entangled, confounded, bemused, until they cannot distinguish between primary and parenthetical discourse at all. The pièce de résistance of the literary parenthesis, Tristram Shandy compels us to contest the rewritten epigraph, because the epigraph is expressed through a parenthesis, and thus both the phenomenon and the parenthesis and the relationship between them require a new reading. Because the text seems to organize itself around the structure of the digression, the epitaph may be read as an understatement. The rhetorical figure of the litotes. It therefore follows that the parenthesis occupies the highest position in the hierarchy of worth previously mentioned, and is the hallmark of all worthy literature. Otherwise, Tristram Shandy's denunciation of the parenthesis also denounces Tristram Shandy. However, before hastily inscribing another epigraph, we should exercise some exegetical caution. Unlike two equal physical forces which oppose one another in such a way that a stasis ensues. Two antithetical readings never erase the read text. Reducing it to a blank space on the page. Despite my readings, the signs of the epigraph will always remain inscribed. Contradiction should not be confused with cancellation. Nevertheless, by professing that either reading of the epigraph is possible, I install a third reading, which the reader may also neither totally accept nor totally reject. The original epigraph withstands our rewritings, but not our rereadings. The Parenthesis, a history of bad press. If spending considerable attention on a single epigraph strikes readers as a trifling and inconsequential way to initiate an examination of the parenthesis, there should be little wonder, for this resistance to what the parenthesis signifies arises from a long history of a privileged monological reading. Such a reading, though, originates not so much from literature as from parenthetical discourse around and within literature. Philological writings on poetics and literary history. Take for example a few of the first English rhetorical handbooks, whose purposes were to revive the classical discipline widely promulgated by Cicero and Quintilian, and to help the student understand poems, orations, and holy scriptures. Henry Peacham's The Garden of Eloquence includes the parenthesis under the generic figure known as hyperbaton. Alteration by the improper placing of words or clauses. the hyperbaton in turn falls under the category of schemates, syntactical, which is a fashion of writing or speaking made new by some art. And from an even more general perspective, the distinction between schemates and tropes asserts that in the trope there is a change of signification, but not in the scheme. So, when describing the parenthesis, Peacham does not perceive it as contributing to the overall meaning of the sentence. For him, a parenthesis occurs when a sentence is set asunder by the interposition of another, or when a sense is cast between the speech before it can be all ended, which although it gives some strength, yet when it is taken away, it leaveth the same speech perfect enough thus. The parenthesis sets asunder the sentence as if the former came after the latter, achieved its integrity. The parenthesis, so to speak, comes late and leaves early, since the reader may take it out of the sentence without even marring or damaging the speech. However, what would happen if we extracted all the parentheses from a particular text? What would the text look like? Would there be spaces where the parentheses once were, huge gaps between words? Containing an entire book on ornament, George Puttenham's The Art of English Poesy not only perpetuates the monological reading of the parenthesis, but also, through its reservations, reveals that this figure is not as harmless as Peacham would have us believe. Puttenham typifies the parenthesis as an auricular figure rather than a sensible figure which serves the conceit alone and not the ear. Like the distinction between trope and scheme, the auricular, sensible division reduces the parenthesis to an unnecessary parcel of speech. And yet, by identifying the parenthesis as the first figure of tolerable disorder. Parenthesis suggests that along with the altering word order, it engenders a controlled anarchy. By the same token, he concludes his section on the figure with a warning. You must not use such insertions often, nor too quick, nor those that be very long, as this of ours, for it will breed great confusion to have the tale so much interrupted. Concerned with poetry, Parenthesis detects the conflict between narrative and parenthesis, a disorder which threatens the identities of these two categories, but still insists on limiting the figure's effect to the level of syntax and the ornamental role of a scheme. Turning to a more recent manifestation of the rhetorical handbook, readers will find the parenthesis still superstructural, but for different reasons. Penguin's A Dictionary of Literary Terms appears to echo Peacham's formulation in emphasizing that the parenthesis makes no substantive difference to the semantics of the sentence. A word, a phrase, or clause put into a sentence which is grammatically correct without the insertion parenthesis is often used when a writer wishes to qualify or add to a statement, end unquote. But whereas Peacham and Parenthesis see an auricular or schematic figure of speech that brings some strength and some beauty to the sentence, a dictionary discerns a grammatical insertion that cannot be distinguished from a non-restrictive clause or phrase which is unessential to the main clause and may also be omitted. Dependent more on cognitive terminology than on grammar, the Harper's Handbook to Literature's entry also limits the parenthesis by regarding it as a word of word, included as a deviation from or addition to the primary flow of thought in a sentence or a paragraph, usually set apart by parentheses. an obstacle or hindrance to the primary flow of thought, the parenthesis diverts the reader away from and out of the text. The parenthesis is thus defined against this primary flow. If we seek a further explanation for the notion primary flow, we might identify it with the notion of unity, which the handbook does define. We might identify it with the notion of unity, which the handbook does define. The quality of an artistic work that allows it to stand as a complete and independent whole, with each part related to each other part, and no part irrelevant or superfluous. End of quote. Appealing to Plato's Phaedrus, because it first proposed the principle of aesthetic unity as a representation of the organic harmony found in nature. The handbook implies that the parenthesis interferes with and is outside the author's primary flow, the work's organic oneness. For the many handbooks which characterize it as if it were its own epitaph, the parenthesis signifies dead text, an appendage to the work which is neither vital nor functional, an appendix which is instead of contributing to organic unity only stores toxic waste, a solute which, defying homogeneity, clouds the solution's transparency. What a good metaphor. The intrusive adjunct which readers quickly skim over to return to live text. This may be true, but if the parenthesized comment is just an insertion with no grammatical connection to the text, why did the author not spend the time to integrate the lazy fragment properly? Have those authors who employ the parenthesis never heard of second drafts? Even if the writer inserts the parenthesized comments later on, why can he not change the entire passage so that it will accommodate these afterthoughts? And then again, if they are not worth integrating into the primary text, why bother to insert them at all? whether after thoughts or before thoughts, the parenthesized comments remain lodged in the text. Furthermore, if parentheses are worthless as our first reading of the epigraph indicated, why are they nonetheless included in all kinds of writings from different historical periods? As we observed in Tristram Shandy, discriminating between primary and parenthetical discourse soon turns into a problematic venture, once the reader realizes that apparent digressions acquire pivotal positions in advancing certain images, motifs, ideas, and other signifying patterns, thwarting the rhetorical and philological handbooks. Literature has a way of confounding the schematic auricular, grammatical and cognitive restrictions applied to this figure. Texts as diverse as gravity's rainbow. I'm going to add a parenthesis. Is this a coincidence? The Sound and the Fury, Moby Dick, The Tale of the Top, The Anatomy of Melancholy, The Fairy Queen, riot in the parenthetical, so much that we are obliged to reconsider the difference between narrative and digression. The problem is one of definition, of coming to terms with what the parenthesis is, without ensnaring ourselves in a privileged reading that validates short-sighted opinions or biases about the parenthesis. To set the record straight, let us consult the handbook of all handbooks, the Oxford English Dictionary, OED, since it is here that the history of reading the parenthesis as an unnecessary accessory reaches a climax. The OED, value-laden quotations. Although the thought that the dictionary codifies the first and the last word of any given word comforts those who have no time to bother with semantics, the dictionary's institutional status does not protect it from critical cross-examination. The accusation brought against the bulwark, perhaps bulwark, B-U-L-L, of the English language. The OED is that through selecting value-laden quotations, epigraphs, it coerces the reader into repudiating the parenthesis significance. For every entry in the OED, quotations arranged chronologically support each of these listed significance in order to illustrate the forms and uses of the word. Now, under the first meaning for parenthesis, the last three quotations cited promote particularly strong prejudices. The first is lifted from Burton's diary. You see the inconveniences of a long parenthesis. We have forgot the sense that went before. Bothersome and troublesome, a plain nuisance. The parenthesis obstructs reading by inducing temporary amnesia in the readers. The inconvenience divides meaningful passages in two, distancing text from the context, distancing the immediate past from the present, as though both writer and reader stood helpless as this diabolical force wiped their short-term memories clean. The third and final quotation, the only one representing the 19th century sense of the parenthesis, is a patchwork of bits and pieces gleaned from Muirhead's Gaius. What is illegible but obvious from the context is in italics within marks of parenthesis. Muirhead sweeps into the parenthesis all that is undecipherable, inscrutable, unreadable, but in the context, primer discourse, the meaning is quite clear. And I end here in this fantastic article. Well, the Newtonian paradigm is in itself disembodied. It is transcendental, causes are outside, time is unreal, space is unknowable by definition or by construct. Instead, initial conditions plus eternal laws are what we have. And I would say that's not definition. Space is by the outset, by the stance that is put. This is similar to subject before space, looking at an object or perceiving an object. It's the structure that defines this. And the structure is not verbal, it's visual, imaginary. The same, well, Robert Grad Williams is pointing to the idea that we can take the parenthesis away to have an exclusion for handen. This is very similar to the Newtonian paradigm. And I claim, unless you have made your use with this single universe, understanding will not come. And then you are bound to exclude, take away parenthesis, And I remember clearly studying literary theory how everything was excluded. Not only parentheses, footnotes, where we were sitting. We were sitting in a room ventilated with air for our intellects, with an environment that was conducive. As long as we started with the stance, the modus, the Stimmung, that the world was outside, that the texts here did not include the parentheses. The parentheses are outside. In the core you find reality. It is similar in this respect to having the idea of excluding a big portion of the universe with the initial conditions. They are not in this world. Initial conditions should not be part of this world. If they were, they couldn't construct the laws. I can't imagine. It's very important to understand that Roberto Unger is not a scientist, because he feels the force in economics, in philosophy, in literature, in politics. This is how we see the world. And if you go to a text, you probably won't agree with what I think is the most marvelous conclusions of Robert Williams, because you will see parentheses as something outside. Could even be that no argument can help you, because you are already disembodied. And if you're not going to exclude the parentheses, you are bound to exclude something else from your reality. That I am pretty sure of. Because the exclusion in itself is caused by the structure, a trope, a vision. Well, of course you also see here how clearly this aligns with the monosemic take, which is different in how it's proposed, different words, different move, but I now see it is the very same thing. This is the closing of the mind, and Williams is pointing to that closing. It's a shutting off of the body, of reality, of the beauty of the poetry, or the lyrics, or the prose. This is how I felt the theory of literature. It was ruled by this, and it took away the explanatory force of the text. It took away the beauty. It took away the presence. It did not what it could have done. Let it open like a flower. It did the opposite. It cut the flower, or if you like, it put it into a box and said, this is the flower and this is external. And all the beauty of the flower is contained here. And you will not see this as a diminishing until you understand the Newtonian paradigm and the cosmological fallacies. You will be ruled by them because they are not arguments in the usual sense. They are things to understand how we've been working up to now, our systems. Dualism is not a theory or an ideology. It's a Stimmung, it's a way to understand. So in a way, I think it's very helpful, Robert Williams. I will take a concluding lecture with this. It's very interesting what he has to say, but on intention, I did not read his conclusions. I use what coming from Roberto Unger. I realize now that the most effective area is not science. It is the other strains of knowledge. And although it's no longer working to speak about eternal laws in economics from a Marxist perspective or Engelian perspective or Keynesian perspective, which is also very usual, it is all infectious. Once you have the disembodied view of knowledge, of understanding, in your whole body-mind system, you will cut out. And could be just a speculation, and just to give you thought, could be what he is trying to help here, which I assume he's going to do, could be helpful to some extent, and we no longer cut out the parenthesis, but we will, because we are having this structure, we cut out something else, the footnote or part of the text, because it is your understanding faculty that is affected. Because as Frederick Matthias Alexander, misuse is not a thing of the body, it's the thing of your intellectual openness. It's the very act of not understanding to a degree, which is also important. There is no zeros and ones here. This will make all other areas bloom, bar none, because exclusion is always the case. This is the reason why the 550 and more pages are well worth reading. Because what from the beginning seemed like such a thin argument, not a thin argument, but thin conclusion of the argument. Yes, there we go. A thin conclusion of the argument, pointing at something so little. It's very far from little. It's humongous. It's the size of the star Betelgeuse. Look it up. Look the star Betelgeuse up. This is the size of what Unger and Smolin made. Yes, thin in the beginning, thinner than the width of a hair, but it becomes humongous, and you realize that you disallowed yourself from enjoying texts and reality, that you, for no good reason otherwise than the Newtonian paradigm, not let yourself understand more, know more, and have more direction. The Unger-Smolin argument will help everyone on this planet. And the more you understand it, the more you will be helped, the more you will get from it. And this also includes the other book, Mindfulness. I don't want to make this too long, but it is obvious here the author wants us to help our mind and help our body relax, and of course put some air, which is not a bad thing. Open the window, go out in nature. But this must be healed. Otherwise you will bring exclusion to all those places, to nature, to the swimming pool, to the yoga practice, to your meditation, and all those things that are suggested, a good run or good, enjoyable, tasty food, which I think is incredibly important. But Newtonian will make you not be able to reach those enjoyments. And some other thing I don't like about mindfulness, it has this cure of an idea. There is a stink and smell of cure, medicinal thing. We are disavowing enjoyment of the world. We need to enjoy and take in the poetry. In every literary lecture course I had, they were killing off the beauty. They were taking off deliberately understanding, and I don't think they had any choice. Every move they made, they pressed, took away parentheses, footnotes, several meanings. They made the text smaller. That was their making. They were not aware of it, yes, but that's all the same was their doings in their action. Because the Newtonian paradigm disembodies ourselves, and it means that you will no longer to the same extent know the result of your actions. And this was the case for these people. I'm not excluding myself here. I did not know why I felt less understanding after a semester of literary theory. And although the teacher often were, especially in English, they were incredibly infused. But they lost it. In the beginning of the lecture, they were astonished by sonnets by William Blake or Shakespeare. At the end of the lecture, we were all tired or frustrated, and we felt this to be the academic doing. We were literally closing off, because this is your Stimmung. This is why the book of Smolin and Unger is so important. Unger wants to help all the other sciences, not what we usually call science, physics only. He will help human beings. He sees how this is into politics, medicine, biology, in between human beings, and this university is epiphany of that. Not even beautifully situated, and it's isolated on a hill. I mean, this is grand. In Oxford, they are sitting smack around where people live, go to the pub, nature, river. This is deemed unimportant here, and that will affect the quality of what you do. First and foremost, the university is excluding. Why should we have a social get-togethering? Why should we talk to people? My body is not part of reality. I'm a brain in a vat. That should be the written under the shield of the university. I am a brain in a vat. My knowledge is not of this world. My words are not of this world. Every beauty of every poetic line needs to be isolated and put in vacuum with no air, so it will suffocate. The same goes for our bodies. When we include the rest of the world, and when we do it in our thinking capacity, when we open up, this book could be accessible also. This is something I try to point out here. The value of the book would be inaccessible to the individual who reads it if he or she shuts off already. It's the very tendency of shutting off, cutting off aroundness. Because this cubicle in itself tricks us to not seeing the surroundings. Because if you're used to taking in everything else, you will not fall into that. Bring in a squirrel here, it will not shut itself off. But I will, because I am in the Newtonian paradigm. This is what makes it so interesting, because it marries with everything. The single universe marries with everything. It infuses it, it brings it out. It doesn't take anything away. It's just marvelous. This disembodied physics. Until now, I think disembodied for me has just been a word. Now it's understandable. Isn't that great? Thank you for your patience. Now you see why these tedious lectures have been a thing. It needs to be understood. Oh, crazy. And that understanding takes time. And I end off here and I say thank you very much. I became a little bit disembodied in the lecture, but that's how enthusiasm could work sometimes. But at least in this case, it's pointing to something marvelous. Bye bye for now, and yes, have a nice afternoon.